Good afternoon, everyone. If you are here to learn more about strengthening your RCDG grant application, you are in the right spot. We're going to give folks just a couple moments to hop on and join us today. Please do use the chat to introduce yourselves in the meantime. And while we let folks join us, I'm actually going to hand things over very quickly to Murtado from Tilda Language Justice Cooperative. And he's going to share some important information on accessing simultaneous Spanish interpretation for today's webinar. Murtado.
Thank you so much for that. Muy buenas tardes y bienvenidos a esta sesión. Vamos entonces a ofrecer servicios de interpretación simultánea y nos vamos a conectar de la siguiente manera. En la parte inferior de sus pantallas ustedes pueden encontrar un globito. Hacen clic en el globo y seleccionan español. De esta manera pueden seguir toda la presentación a través de los servicios de interpretación. Si se están conectando desde una tableta o desde un teléfono inteligente, vayan a donde están los 3 puntos. Ahí ven en pantalla, dice más o more en inglés. Hacen clic, seleccionan interpretación del idioma, español y luego terminado para que se active esta función. Si se han unido a través de un dispositivo Linux o un Chromebook, les recomendamos que cambien de dispositivo porque lastimosamente no funcionan bien con la aplicación de Zoom. Muchas gracias y que disfruten de esta sesión. Thank you so much and we appreciate for the creation of this multilingual space. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Murtado. Once again, good afternoon, folks, and welcome to our webinar today. We're so excited to have our friends from USDA's Rural Development Cooperative Service back with us today, this time to walk through the RCDG grant application and making sure that you are in the best position to take advantage of those funds. My name is Liz, and I'm going to review just a couple housekeeping items before we get started. So again, thank you for joining us. We have an hour and a half together today. We do want this to be an interactive conversation, so we encourage you to use the chat feature, use the Q&A feature, ask your questions from our moderators and our panelists today. We have a team here on the back end who's going to be monitoring that conversation, and we'll do our best to get to as many of those questions as possible. And as always, this webinar is being recorded, so you will have an opportunity to share it with your networks or refer to it afterward. Or if you do need to hop off at that hour mark, you can catch up on the rest of our conversation a bit later. So let's get things started. It's my pleasure to hand things over to one of our presenters, Margaret Bao. She's going to kick off the conversation for us. Margaret is a cooperative development specialist for USDA Rural Development. And Margaret, we are thrilled to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you, Liz. And could you forward the slide? Perfect. Thank you. Just wanted to start off by saying thank you to all the people across the country that are engaged in cooperative development. This is the one federal program that funds cooperative development, and it's amazing the work that takes place for a mere $5.8 million. So we wanted to introduce ourselves. Jim Wadsworth is our branch team. We have a small but mighty team. I am based in Wisconsin, been a longtime co-op developer. Megan is based in Virginia, and she specializes in legal and tax issues related to cooperatives. Debbie Rausch, we consider her bilingual. She has a depth of knowledge about co-op development. She's formed many co-ops herself, but she also has a deep funded program experience within USDA Rural Development. And Robbie Fauser-Fink is the newest member of our team, and she comes with many years of experience in Kentucky with the funded programs. And she has a keen eye for funding opportunities that co-op development centers and co-ops themselves can take advantage of. So next slide, please. So what is the purpose of the Rural Cooperative Development Grant, also known as the RCDG? It has several areas of focus: to develop or operate a cooperative development center, which will create cooperatives and mutually owned businesses in rural communities across the United States. to create or save jobs in those rural communities, and to provide education and technical assistance to support cooperatives in rural communities. Next slide, please. Applications can be from nonprofit institutions or institutions of higher learning. This is a one-year grant. So grants, once awarded, can begin either October 1st, anytime between October 1st or up to December 31st. Eligible use of funds are to, once again, provide technical assistance and cooperative education. If you are a 1994 institution, which tend to be Native American institutions, the match required is 5% to every federal dollar. For all other applicants, it is a 25% match for federal dollars. And it's important that in order to access these funds, you have to register in a program called SAMS, and you have to acquire a UEI, which is a unique entity identifier. And we'll go into more detail about that in the rest of the presentation. And these slides will be available with all the links provided. So next slide, please. And I am going to hand it over to Robbie.
Good afternoon or good morning to some. I want to go over the RCDG proposal sections, and we want to make sure that you know what are the required forms. And pardon me, I gotta change something. There we go. So I could see the whole slide. So there's the SF-424 for the application for federal assistance that's required. I would call that your legal document for your actual application. And then it also has instructions. All of these, if things are underlined on this slide, that should be a link to that form or information for you. And then also we've got the most fun budget information there. We also wanted to give you another link to the 424 family of documents, and also a question is a CFDA number that's required on the form to give you that, and also the Federal Register, the link to that, to the notice of funding opportunity for this year. Because it's very important that you read the notice to know all the qualifications for the program, and also to reach out to your state office and to talk with the program specialist if you can. If you have any questions, if you're unable to reach them, though, you can reach out to any one of us or all of us and see if we can't get your question answered. But it's always good to speak with a specialist, let them know what you're planning to do, or if you have any questions. And it's also good because if the state office has time, they might do a review of the documents just to make sure that you're an eligible applicant, and it is what we call deemed complete, means you've put in all the documents that we need. And of course, we always tell people to start as soon as possible and don't wait till the last minute. And if you can advance to the next slide, and I'm just going to make sure it's my microphone working better. If anyone wants to. I hope it is.
Yes,
okay, cool. Thanks. The next section is other documents or documentation that is needed for your narrative, your proposal. And on the left side of the screen are the different sections that are required. I'm not going to read them out, but you can hopefully see them there. I guess maybe I should read them for people that are joining on the phone. Of course, there's a title page, table of contents, a 2-page limit on an executive summary, a 2-page limit on applicant eligibility, and a project narrative. And the girls can correct me if I'm wrong, but that executive summary and the applicant eligibility is part of the 40-page limit of the project narrative, which goes into eligibility, goals, performance measures, undertakings, project period, verification and certification of matching funds, your work plan, and scoring criteria. On the right side of the screen are, again, links to documents that should be helpful. We have an application template. We use that word template because you don't have to use it, but it's what we need, the information we need to make sure you're eligible, your application is complete, and it would have the scoring information that we need as well, the information that we require. There's also a checklist link there, and also different ways for you to verify your match. And I believe the next screen is going to be Deb's, if you want to advance the slide.
Okay. Now Robbie's told you all the administrative parts of the forms that we need. And now we're going to talk about the scoring criteria, or the things that we're going to use to evaluate your application. There, as you see here, there's 10 scoring criteria. Each of them is worth 10 points. And you'll notice in the blue box, we've tried to make it simpler in the blue box. The language from the NOFA is typically on the left, and the blue box is a more popular, down-to-earth explanation of what you see on the left-hand side. So the maximum point score for a new applicant is 110 points. The 10 scoring criteria plus 10 points from the administrator points. Any previous awardee can only receive 5 points on the administrator points. So their top point score would be 105. And it's a way to give a leg up to the new applicants. And that's something that was decided at the administrator level. And so you'll see the scoring criteria here. Each of those is worth 10 points, and how well you score will depend on how well you answer and how detailed you address each of these areas. So some areas you might do well on, past performance. If you're a newer center, that may be a little bit of a struggle, but there may be other ways that you can really flesh out your score on other sections. So that's kind of what part of what we wanted to have today was help you understand that when the applications come to the panel and we read those, what we're looking at is, okay, we've read all of the applications, the ones that are really good, how do they stack up next to each other? And so that's how we're going to look, and we look at each individual criteria and score those that way. So let's jump in to the next slide, please, and we'll go over the first scoring criteria there, which is administrative capabilities.
Actually, Deb, could we
yes.
back up just a little bit?
Sure.
First, we got a question about whether a grocery co-op, the startup grocery co-op, could apply for RCDG funds. Could you clarify that?
Let's see.
So Jean asked
Sure,
whether her grocery startup co-op could apply for RCDG funds.
If the grocery startup is a 501c3 and is going to do economic development or co-op development rather than be in the grocery business, yes, they could. Or if they have an arm where that's something that they're going to do, that's it's a little murky. They cannot use grant funds to open their grocery. They cannot use grant funds to operate the grocery, hire staff, any of those things. They are strictly technical assistance for entities other than the applicant. So the applicant cannot use the funds for themselves in any way other than to pay staff to organize economic development efforts and cooperative development efforts. Does that help?
So Margaret recommended several co-op development centers that might help Jean. And we maintain a list of those centers at our website for the cooperative development branch. So you can find it there. You can also reach out to Cooperation Works. Then another question about the page limits. Brent asked about whether the executive summary and eligibility discussion count toward the 40-page limit. And we noted that we had a clarification from Lisa Sharp, the RCDG program administrator, that they actually do count toward the 40-page limit.
Yeah, and that's a little bit of a, in the past, it's been interpreted differently, but when you go back and actually read the way it's written, that is correct. The whole application is 40 pages, exclusive of the appendices, but the executive summary, and that is included in the 40-page limit. So choose your words wisely, I guess is the first piece of advice when you're going through. If you can say it in 2 sentences, say it in 2 sentences. Don't worry about trying to create half a page to do that. Okay, back to where. Let's flip that over. Okay. On the administrative capabilities, one of the things that we're looking for there is, you'll notice in the blue box, it talks about what kind of financial systems the entity has. And this is pulled out of directly out of the 7 CFR, which is what the NOFA references. But most people don't go back and read that. So we wanted to make sure that you understood what all of the components were of administrative capabilities. So discuss your financial systems, any audit controls that you have in place, rules of governance. How is your board designed? Is your board advisory, or does it have full authority to make budget decisions, personnel decisions, and commit the applicant to activities, both financial and technical? And then we're looking for performance measures for both the program and personnel. So we want to know, how are you going to evaluate your program that you're proposing, or your program as you have done it in the past, and then how do you evaluate your personnel? And then the last one is experience administering national and regional or statewide grants. And that's where you're going to provide us with a list of federal grants, state grants that you have gotten in the past, and the dollar amount for those. Okay, and with that, I think the next scoring criteria is Margaret's. So next slide.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that, Debbie. The next major area is looking at technical assistance and other services. And what is key about this scoring criteria, it is about your past performance, your past experience in providing technical assistance and accomplishing effective outcomes in cooperative development and mutually owned businesses. So there are 5 components there. So you'll want to address every single one of them. Everything you see in the notice of funding availability in the NOFA, be sure to address. Number 1, the potential for delivering effective technical assistance. What have you done in the past? The types of assistance provided. What did you do in the past? What types of, did you do feasibility studies? Did you write some business plans? Did you provide basic co-op education? Did you help the group think through their bylaws? Number 3, the expected effects of that assistance. What happened in the past when you provided the technical assistance? What were the results of that? What happened? Number 4, the sustainability of the organizations that received your assistance in the past. Are they still in business? Were they in business for 5 years, 10 years? Did they decide not to incorporate? That's all legitimate discussion. And number 5, the transferability of the applicant's cooperative development strategies and focus to other areas within the United States. Please don't talk about what it could be used for or how other parts of the country could benefit from this. Talk about what has actually happened in the past. For example, we helped form a grocery cooperative in Westby, Wisconsin. And as a result, those bylaws were transferred and shared with a similar co-op in Rochester, outside of Rochester, Minnesota. Be very specific about what has happened in the past. So the cheat sheet in the blue squiggly box there, cooperative development technical assistance in the past over a 5-year period. Don't go on about what you did 20 years ago. Talk about what you have done in the last 5 years. Describe the technical assistance you have provided. Can that technical assistance has those methods, have they been used in other areas in the past? And what type of effects did it have on the economic conditions? Provide some specific examples. For example, if you help form a home care worker cooperative, be specific and say, and it increased wages by 25 cents, something like that. How long have the cooperative stayed in business? And provide it in a chart form, because I'm sure you have lots of examples. You can make it easier for you to summarize what has happened in the past, and it helps with the reviewers to quickly see what you have done in the past. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So economic development, past, establishing cooperatives and mutually owned businesses, the retaining of businesses, generating employment, and creating new cooperative approaches. So you'll want to talk about those quantifiable measures of the impact of the technical assistance, how many jobs were created, how many jobs were saved. If you are working with housing cooperatives, how many units of housing or how many households now have housing because of your work. And very importantly, describe your role in providing that economic development in that technical assistance. Let's go on to the next slide to talk about those new cooperative approaches, because this can be an area of confusion. We tried to provide some examples here, new cooperative approaches, organizing cooperatives among underserved individuals or communities. Perhaps it's an innovative market approach. Perhaps it's a type of cooperative that is not currently in your service area. For example, if you are a cooperative development center with many years of experience, perhaps you started to do conversions of existing businesses to either shared services or to consumer cooperatives or to worker cooperatives. It could be a new type of cooperative structure, maybe a multi-stakeholder cooperative, maybe it's a real estate cooperative. Some of those are hot topics right now. Perhaps an example of a new cooperative approach is a novel way to raise member equity or to encourage community capitalization in that cooperative. Or as I mentioned, conversion of an existing business to cooperative ownership. And with all of this, be sure to provide something tangible, the economic impact, and describe your role in providing those outcomes.
Margaret,
So-
just quickly,
Yes.
there's a question, can technical assistance and their effects include what was done under other grants? Like, for example, for SDGG or just before you use the RCDG grant?
Oh, very good question. Yes, yes. You know, however your efforts were funded, yes, please make mention of that. Good question. Thank you.
There's a couple others in the Q&A. Do you want me to read those, Margaret?
Slowly, yes, please.
Yes, I'll do my best. It's from Hannah. For this scoring criteria, can we include the expertise or experience of subcontractors as well?
Yes, if you
Okay.
will use those subcontractors into the future.
And then Kevin has a question. Are the TA activities restricted only to rural co-ops experiences, or are urban experiences relevant?
Good question, Kevin. Yes, urban experiences would be relevant to prove that your center has the capacity to do that work.
All right. And another one from Kevin is, when the NOFA says within the past 5 years, does that mean 5 calendar years from the date of application, or the last full 5 federal fiscal years, or something else?
Let's take a broad approach to 5 years and leave it at that. We're not going to get out a calendar and check, oh, is that the federal fiscal year or is that a calendar year? Within reason.
We have another question. Could a cooperative outside the US apply for RCDG?
Sadly, no. This program is available only for projects in rural areas of the United States. Sorry.
And that includes
And the
territories
US
of the United States.
Yes, and the territories.
Correct. So the Pacific territories, the territories in the territories, and other areas of the Caribbean.
And Margaret, I'm checking on the timeline for the 5 years.
And there's one more question. Yeah, go ahead, Debbie, but one more question from Brent. One more question on page limit. Do the certification statements, judgment, and matching funds count towards the 40-page limit now?
Yes, they do, because they're part of your eligibility discussion.
But not the appendices, and those attachments do
Right.
not count.
Correct. The appendices part of it, so the actual documentation and the support or the letters to verify it do not, but the discussion does.
I think this brings up a point. Try your best to get your application done early enough that you can show it to state office personnel, so that they can, make sure that your reading of the NOFO is proper, but then also read it very carefully yourself. Make sure that you read it as you're doing, before you do your application.
Okay.
Okay, Margaret,
Yes.
on economic development, it says provide information for a minimum fiscal year 2018 through fiscal year 2022. So that would be October 1st, 2017 through September 31st, 2023.
Thank you for that clarification, Debbie.
Debbie, can you type that in the chat on that answered
Sure can.
question? Okay, thank you.
Sure can. Oh,
And while Debbie is doing that, I don't think we have any more questions. So I believe, let's advance one more slide, please. Past performance. I
And
believe
that's
that.
me.
Thank you.
So that's Megan, and I'll just go ahead and talk about the past performance. Please note that, well, first of all, when you're talking about past performance, you list the cooperative and other businesses established since 2018. And again, we're talking about that 5-year limit, and note that this is the fiscal year. So you're going to want to put down the name, the dates of formation, and your role with the incorporations. And you can put documents in Appendix C, and the documents that you would put would be certificate of incorporation from the state's official website, or if the state doesn't require you to register, a certification from the entity that a legal business entity has been established. And you make sure that you put the date in as well. You're not required to submit articles of incorporation to receive points under this criteria. Applicants that have established legal cooperative businesses are going to score higher because they've established legal cooperative businesses. If the applicant state doesn't incorporate cooperative business entities, please describe how the established business entity operates like a cooperative. So if you look at the blue box, which is where we try to explain the wording of the NOFA, what you want to do with a business that's not incorporated under a cooperative statute, describe how it's truly a cooperative. So you're going to describe how there's democratic control over the entity. You're going to describe how there's shared ownership. Very importantly, you're going to describe the distribution of net income and how that's based on use. And please do describe other cooperative principles and practices. So next slide. With respect to networking and regional focus, we're going to be evaluating your commitment to networking with other cooperative development centers and organizations involved in rural economic development. And we want to look at your multi-organizational and multi-state approaches to addressing the economic development and cooperative needs of rural areas. So if you want to score higher, we want you to discuss the projects and the roles of each entity involved, and make sure that you tie the project to the service area. We're looking for a description of the projects, your partners in the projects, and the outcomes that resulted from the approach. And you're going to score higher if you can demonstrate the outcomes of your multi-organizational and multi-state approaches. So next slide, I can't remember who is up next.
I believe it's
So I
Robbie.
think you think it's me. We did have a couple more questions. I know you guys are answering them in the chat and the Q&A. Do we want to read them or continue?
Yes, please.
Okay. Okay. Let me get over there. Sorry. All right. So there is a clarification that Debbie has put in the chat. I also put it, Kevin, to your question about the 5 years. So the time frame is fiscal year 2018 to fiscal year 2022, which means October 1st of 2017 through September 30th of 2022. Yes, I got to scroll down here. And I think it is, do the past performance include non-RCDG related projects, cooperatives formed where we used other funding sources? And Debbie's answer was yes, you can include co-ops created with other funding. The key is to illustrate the ability to create co-ops. Those are the answered ones. There's two that are unanswered. Does the economic development criteria need to solely focus on cooperative business development?
I think Margaret may be typing, and I hope that we'll say the same thing. The economic development can include business development skills that would help enhance the cooperative itself. So you're looking at doing marketing plans, doing business plans, developing financial statements. All of those things are traditional business development skills that transfer well to cooperative development. So if those are the types of skills that you're thinking of, then yes, those would be good to include in the economic development.
Okay.
There is one clarification question from Kevin Edberg. So could economic development or technical assistance provided after October 31st of 2022, can that be used? And Debbie, you said.
Yes, the way it is written is at a minimum 5 years. So if you have something more recent, by all means include that. But what we don't want to see is reaching back 20 years. You know, we want to keep it to 5 years and up to application if that's appropriate.
Thank you for that clarification.
All right. Another
So-
question. Oops, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead,
There's
Marina.
another interesting question. In Tennessee, there's no general cooperative corporate statute to organize under, except for ag and electric. If, for example, a landscaping, food, or housing LLC operates on a cooperative basis, should we include bylaw language? You can. And I don't believe, please correct me if I'm wrong, that it would count toward the page limit. I think you can put it in the appendix. What we ask you to do in the body of the application is just describe those factors that I listed, which are, you know, is there democratic governance? Is there, you know, common ownership of all the members? And is patronage distributed based on use of the cooperative? Those are the big factors. You know, bylaws are extra. We like to look at them, but they're not entirely necessary.
Right.
Just to remind everybody, this is the only federal program that is directed at, you know, financing cooperatives. And we do, you know, personally like it, you know, when this money is used for true cooperatives, which include those cooperatives that can't incorporate under a cooperative statute, but operate like cooperatives.
Can I throw something out there, Megan?
No, Debbie, you can't.
If your state doesn't have a co-op statute that is appropriate for the entity that you're trying to incorporate, there is always the possibility to incorporate in another state and then operate in your home state as a non-domestic entity.
There are pros and cons to that, but you need
Correct.
to talk to your local lawyer about them.
Exactly. But
accountant.
that's another option that they could use as a way around it. So.
And include your accountant, correct, or accounting service, because there's
That's always
those
good too.
issues. All right. I'm not seeing any more questions yet, so I'll go ahead with the RCDG commitment. So applicants will score higher on this criterion by defining and describing the underserved and economically distressed areas within the service area. I say that again because it's the applicant that defines what makes the area or population underserved or distressed, but you need to use data. So economic statistics or identify past or current projects within or affecting these areas as you would feel it's appropriate. We will give, excuse me, score higher if the counties you are doing the project in are what we deem persistent poverty. And you can click on that link there and see a map. Our hope was to have you a public spreadsheet with a name list, like in an alphabetical order for the counties in your area, so you could search it that way if you'd want. But I don't have that yet, but we will give that to NCBA to, if they don't mind, to distribute that for us. Or if you want to email us, we'd be happy to send it when it is available. Next slide, please. All right, matching funds. So the match required is 25%. Unless you are a 1994 institution, it is 5% of the project. So make sure you understand that that is for the project, not the grant funds. That mistake has also been made and has been, unfortunately, people deemed ineligible. Applicants scored on amount and are scored on amount and type of matching funds, whether it's cash or in kind. You want to provide a chart or a table, and your formal documentation would be in Appendix A, and several slides before we gave you the links to that. Okay, I didn't know if someone had a question. And you can see the points on the right of where your points would lay if you just meet the 25%, or if you exceed it, you're going to get more of those points. And before we go to the next slide, Tracy McIntyre is asking, can we include projects that are not funded under RCDG in the commitment? Comment I received last year said it was unclear how RCDG funds were being used versus SDGG funds. If you're including projects, Tracy, you're going to have to identify, I would say, were you using past or future, or was it in your work plan? That's where it gets, I would say, muddied, is where we need those clarifications, because if it's in your past performance, you can use however you provided that assistance. But if you're talking about it in your work plan and you are also or have also applied for SDDG, you need to make sure that those work plans are very clear of what's being spent on with SDGG funds and what's being provided on RCDG. So we, as someone reviewing it, can make sure, they're not double dipping. They're not getting paid for a business plan for ABC co-op with SDGG and RCDG. I hope that explains it. And Tracy, if it doesn't, let us know if that answers your question. Kevin asks, can the commitment criteria be met with solely past work in underserved, economically distressed as defined by the applicant, or is the highest score require activities in the application's work plan be in such areas?
Well, commitment, the commitment section is for what you are proposing to do.
Which should mirror the work plan.
Yeah, right. That you have identified, that your service area, and then you identify specific projects that are in your work plan that are underserved.
Or economically distressed.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Actually, Margaret, it's both, because the NOFA has identified past or current projects within those areas. So you can identify what you have done in the past, and to score higher, you would need to identify both going forward. You're going to continue doing that.
Okay. Because that section has, it's kind of like two components to that section.
Yes.
And Kevin, if you want to clarify that, if we didn't answer it and why you are typing that, if you need to. Deb says, how do you determine when the 10 points awards? So Deb, I'm not sure if you can clarify that.
Do you mean matching funds, Deb?
Yes, matching funds. So I don't, Deb, you may not be able to see the screen, but if it's, you exceed, the application exceeds 25% match and it's cash only, you can score up to 10 points. Is that?
Yes.
Well, I was going to say, I don't know if that answers her question, but hopefully. I'm not seeing.
Sandra is asking, are there
Yeah,
any,
okay.
I think what she's asking for, if you score low in one criteria, does that affect how you'll score in another criteria?
I could say that depends.
Well, what I
No.
answered was
Well,
each criteria is evaluated separately.
Correct.
unless you refer back to that section. And you're
By page
using
number.
Yeah, that page number. And it didn't really answer the question. That would be the only time we would go back to that section, because yes, they're all evaluated separately unless you refer back to that page number.
That is a good tip, though. You may be able to address what's required in two different criteria sections by referring to one section. And I didn't explain that well, but you may be able to describe what you've done in the past in one section. And then in a second section, you can save, pages by referring back to that prior section, so long as, you've addressed both criteria. Maybe somebody can explain it better.
And Sanders replied with, each year we match over 25%, but score only 8 on match. And I'd say, instead of getting in the weeds with specific people, I would say, Sandra, then, just email us and maybe give us what your comments were, and we can maybe address it then, if that would be all right.
Actually, I think Charlotte addressed it. You have to exceed the match to be able to get the full points.
Right. You have to exceed it. So 26% and up, and it has to be all cash.
And then she added, in recent years, we've needed to get 30% or more to get all 10 points. Has that changed? Nope.
That's
Because
still the same.
yeah. All right. I'm going to ask you to advance the next slide. please. Thank you. Explanation of in-kind match, which could be goods, services, can be provided by the applicant or third party. It must be able to demonstrate, the applicant must demonstrate how that match is valued. Key also is if the applicant pays cash, check, however, for goods, services, it is considered to be a cash match. Also, applicant staff time is considered cash because that entity is paying that person's salary. And on the right, we're gonna, we're highlighting that cash scores higher. And documentation must be provided by the person, either the applicant or a third party, providing the in-kind match. When you do that, make sure you have, date that verification, the type of goods or services, the value of that goods or services, the time frame that those goods or services are available for the grant, and ineligible examples of any type of match would be anything that's ineligible for funding, which is like equipment, which is anything valued 5,000 or more. We call that equipment. Anything valued like nowadays a typical laptop is well under that, so that we call that a supply. Land is ineligible or operating costs. Next slide, please. And Deb, I think this is turning it over to you. I am not seeing any.
This is, and I'm sorry, I was looking for questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think Kevin wanted more information on working in, high poverty areas.
Kevin, I have an insight for you. You're in Minnesota. And you work in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa. And we're fortunate that we have very few persistent poverty counties where there's one in Wisconsin, I believe there's one in Minnesota. So unless you have a project identified, you've done past work there and you have a project identified, you would not be able to score the maximum of 10 points.
Okay, are we set? Okay. I'm sorry?
Deb was asking if you exceed the match requirement and it's all cash, when do you get all the 10 points? And she said Charlotte kind of answered that, you need to exceed 30, but you also need to make sure you have the correct verification as what we just went over, the date, the type of goods, how it's valued, etc.
And one additional thing that I would point out on the match is the applicant can only verify the match that they provide. Any other match, say somebody donates cash to them and they can use it for whatever they want, or they're providing services. The individual that's doing that needs to be the one signing the verification. Okay. And that's the reason that we attached all those forms in there, so that you can understand the differences between how it's provided and who has to sign to verify that match. Okay, are we good to move to the work plan?
We have one more question that came in from Lori Sepu. Lori is still confused. Back to the question on including outcomes from technical assistance funded from sources other than the RCDG. It is fine to include the outcomes as long as we clearly define that we are not double dipping, correct? We received a different answer previously, that we should not include that technical assistance, and it makes a big difference in quantifying outcomes.
Okay, there's a couple of things. And I think where the issue is, to show experience in developing cooperatives, yes, you can include wherever you do that and whoever funded it. If you're showing administrative expertise, or not administrative, technical assistance, you can also include it there because you're doing the technical assistance and we're looking at experience. That's really what you're looking for. On the commitment side, what we're looking for is the commitment to using the RCDG funds to develop cooperatives. In your work plan, we're looking at, how are you using RCDG funds to work on projects? So there are specific places where you're going to want to highlight what you've done with RCDG funds. But if the criteria is asking you to demonstrate experience or demonstrate ability to work with those types of projects, you can include other projects that you've worked on. Same as when we get down to talking about key personnel, and we'll kind of get into the weeds with that a little bit as well.
Thank you.
Okay.
And then we've got another question. Do the services funded under this grant need to be offered free of charge to the end users or cooperative clients?
Boy, that's a can of worms. They do not have to, but if grant funds are used to generate income, then you've created what's called program income. And you have to either use that to expand the services provided overall, or that gets deducted from the grant fund itself. And there's a whole process to do that. So what I would say is, if you're going to charge for services in any form, and it's RCDG funding that created that opportunity, then you need to identify how that income or program income is going to be used. And my suggestion, because there's 3 different ways you can do it, you can use it to replace match. So you can conserve cash that way. You can use it to expand services provided to clientele. And if you do none of those, if you don't do those first 2 things as an option, then we're required to deduct that from your grant amount because you've earned cash as a result of it. That's not our choice. That's in the CFR. It's USDA wide. That happens with every grant. So my suggestion to you is, if you plan to charge for services and you do not have a lot of expenses to offset that to where you would end up with 0 net program income, then identify that you're going to use those program income funds, net program income funds, to increase the services provided to cooperatives and increase opportunity to bring in expertise or something along those lines. You would need to describe how you're going to use that program income. And if you want more detail on that, please email me and I would be happy to get you the references and more information on how that's calculated. Okay. Are we safe to move on? I can't see okay, we'll move on. Okay, the work plan and budget. This is, in my opinion, by far the most important piece of the scoring criteria. It needs to be detailed enough that the scoring panel can understand what you're trying to do, understand who will be doing the work, what their qualifications are, the timeframes that work is going to take place. So really what you're looking at is building yourself, and I've said this to others as well, sit down and make yourself a chart of, these are the tasks, and then go across and say, this is how I'm going to identify who is going to be that customer. They can be someone that you've already worked with or you've already identified. If they're not, then you need to tell us how you're going to find that customer or that client. Then the next column over, I'd put key personnel. Please don't write everybody in the grant in there unless everybody's going to touch that particular project. It kind of makes it look a little fishy when you do that. If there are certain people that are going to work on multiple projects, that's fine, but identify what it is that they're contributing to that project or to that task. And then identify evaluation methods. And for this, we want you to go beyond just counting how many people participated in the program or how many people that you've worked with or numbers of businesses. While those are good information and things that we want, we also want to know in more detail the qualitative impact of the work that you've done. Go through and describe how you're going to identify what that qualitative evaluation is. And in the blue box there, you see that it includes things like written responses, follow up with a survey for the clients, do a pre and post test to help identify the different areas of things they may have learned in a workshop that you've created or hosted. Conducting interviews, doing spotlights with groups that you've worked on, do discussions, discussion groups, take notes from those, use those in your application to identify, oh, these are some of the impacts that we've had going forward. And then anything from written documents, if you provide an annual report or the clients that you're working with would provide you with an annual report or a letter of, hey, this is what we did. A couple of different things. You can use those letters also as support letters farther on. We'll get there, but there's different ways to use those qualitative evaluations that you're going to do down the road when you need those for the following year. And then there were a couple of things. Key personnel, if that person is yet to be hired, if it's a new position or it's a consultant that has not yet been hired, describe the skills that you want that person to bring. Describe how what that person is going to do for the project. Okay.
And that could be something like oh gosh, the word just came out, like a job
description. Just
job
provide
description.
a description of the project that they're going to be
Very
in.
short.
Yeah, just real short. Doesn't need to
Short.
be what you would hand a job applicant, but it needs to be enough that we could say, okay, yeah, those skills are going to match up with that task.
Mhm.
Okay. Oh yeah, there's another one. And this goes back a little bit to Sandra's question about different criteria affecting other criteria. With the work plan, you're also going to include the budget. By task, you're going to identify how much of the RCDG funds go to that task, and you're going to identify how much of your match is going to go to each of those tasks. It does not have to be 25, 75 for every single task. That said, keep in mind that you can only draw down or get reimbursed based on the amount of match that has already been put forward. It does impact how quickly reimbursements can happen, because the way it works is you have to spend, we can only reimburse 75% when 25% has been met. So if it's possible, front load your match in your budget on the front end of your projects. Okay. The other way that budget and your match would impact the work plan and the budget is if you have more than 10% ineligible costs in your budget. And we're talking 10% of your total project costs. So for example, if you have $100,000 as your total project costs, 75% or 75,000 would be grant money, 25,000 would be match. If you had more than $10,000 in ineligible costs, your grant would get kicked out It would be deemed ineligible. If you have less than that, your grant will be scored, but those tasks will be removed from the grant because they're ineligible and we cannot fund ineligible. Okay. And I think we'll move on to the next slide.
I had something on the work plan also, Deb. Is when you're putting in amounts, we like to know how you arrived at that amount. So if you're doing, I don't know, $10,000 worth of business plans assistance, how did you arrive at that number? Was that, and I'm
So
just
many
throwing out numbers.
hours, so many
You know,
hours
so
times.
many, yeah. So the
$50
rate of
an hour.
pay, yeah. Just think of how did you arrive at that number so we know that you're not just picking it out of the air. That helps us, and that's another way you can define, you know, how is it clarified if you're doing SDGG as well, is splitting that, describing what's in that task and how you got to that number.
Yes. And thank you, Robbie. That brings up another point. One of the things that we also have to do is make sure that your work plan is not duplicating services. So when you're identifying your customers, if they are customers or clients that you worked with last year, then the task that you were doing with them needs to be new. So they can't be repeating something that they did last year. So if they did a business plan last year, they're not going to do a business plan with you this year. They're going to move on and do something else. If you are working with new clients or customers that you have not worked with before, you can do the same types of things that you did the year before. But the client, you either have to have new clients and tasks you've done before, or no, wait a minute. I'm going to get it backwards. New clients with tasks you've done before, or existing clients with new tasks.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
And I think you just answered that, but Josh has in a work plan budget section, there's a note that says the agency normally allows one active award to ensure that there's no duplication of services. If we are applying for RCDG to provide similar programming as what was proposed in a SDGG application, but in new rural locations, would this be considered duplication of services?
Yeah, it would not. What you need to do in the work plan is identify, yes, we have an SSDG that we're going to be working on, but those clientele are separate and distinct from the clientele that you're working with in the RCDG. It's either a different area, it's a different task, it's different folks.
And Thomas is asking, what if the task is ongoing financial training? Again, I would clarify how it's different.
Right. I mean, you can do ongoing financial training and say you have it divided up in a series of, this is the introduction, this is a more intermediate financial training, this is a more advanced financial training, and look at it from that standpoint. Just identify how it is different than what they've received the previous grant period.
An example of that, maybe previous year you did a business plan, and this year you're doing bylaw drafting or something. You're not doing business plan over year after year for that client. That'd be a good example.
Yeah, or financial training, if you had it broken down, you know, what his
sections
is financial, you had it in sections where you say, okay, this is an introduction to what a income statement looks like. This is an introduction to balance sheets. And then you move on to, you know, doing the reconciliation. You move on to more advanced topics like tracking for patronage, doing financials for pooling, doing some of those kinds of things where you would get more in depth into the specifics of the cooperative's financials rather than just understanding the income statement and balance sheet. Then you look at it more from a cooperative perspective. Then you can go into it more and on doing
Taxation.
campaigns, taxation, those kinds of things would be another. Does that
Yeah,
help, Tom?
allocated and unallocated reserves. And
Yes, yeah. So you get more into the weeds. There's different ways that you can do that where you can say, we're holding this one for new customers, second one for people we've worked with that are ready to go to in more in depth and do it that way.
Kevin
We
has
have
a
another-
question. The work plan criterion requires a detailed work plan. What constitutes sufficient detail to achieve highest score? Do we need to get into the levels of month-by-month activity? When the bookkeeper invoices for services, how many contacts with the client will be made, etc.? Or are we sufficient to identify who is providing the task, a reasonable statement of the work to be done and outcomes to be achieved, etc.?
I would say the latter of that. It's sufficient to tell us, what the intent of the task is, who's going to be carrying out that task. How are you going to, excuse me, how are you going to evaluate that task? Narrative of why you're doing that task, or how that fits into the overall goals of the center would be one way to really bump that up as far as what the description is. I'm trying to think of different ways. Reasonable timelines would be another one. Typically what we've seen in the past is where they're doing a timeline, they identify a task and the timeline runs all year. But when you look at the task, that that's not something that's going to run all year. Then it kind of gets a little murky. So if you're doing, program development, to do that probably at the beginning of your grant period, or maybe at the end after you've identified tasks and things that need to be done. So you're working with a particular client and that there's some background work that needs to be done before you get into the actual nuts and bolts of tasks and services that you're going to provide with that client. If you've got those timelines identified as ongoing all year, working with groceries, or we're going to work with worker co-ops and we're going to work all year with those. That's not really enough detail to tell what it is you're doing. But if you can tie it back into how it fits into the goals of the center, a short description of what you're doing, why you're doing it, who's going to be providing the services. I personally do not want to know what your bookkeeper is doing and how long that's the state office's job. That's not the scoring panel's job. We're looking at, does the task make sense? Is it in a logical order? Do outcomes or proposed outcomes, have they been identified? Have you talked about how you're going to evaluate it and what you're going to do going forward for other co-ops? Those kinds of things, which are the detail that we're looking for in that.
So Thomas Beckett asked a question: does the presentation today represent a departure from RD's approaches to scoring in previous years? And then he had also asked, where did a 30% matching funds requirement come in?
I think what we're trying to do today is give you what we have heard, me, maybe not including me, but obviously Margaret, Megan, and Debbie in years past in the scoring. Each year the scoring may be different because you're looking at the applications you've received that year. And so it can be different, but we're trying to give you tips of where we may have seen mistakes, or like what I would call a common mistake, or maybe someone gave very detailed answer, or described it in great detail, and someone just put, like you said earlier, ongoing financial training, and instead of explaining what exactly that financial training was going to include. I hope that answers the question. And the 30% matching funds was in regards to how do you get up to 10%. That is, it's a possible if, since you're exceeding the 25, the 30, it's possible to get up to that 10, but you've got to have the correct verification and things of that nature. So
Yeah.
in the interest of time, I think we need to keep.
Yeah, the 30, I think, is a historical thing that's been there. I don't know where that came from. It's been historical. This is the same thought process, and I think, as far as how we've looked at the scoring going from year to year, it's been fairly consistent. The key is to keep in mind, you're not being compared to your application last year. You're compared to the other applications that are at the table this year.
Mhm.
So you may write something fantastic, and this year, or last year, you may have written something absolutely fantastic and were funded and didn't have any comments. This year, part of the panel will be new, part of the panel will be existing folks that have participated before. Everybody reading them will see different things. So the comments may be different, but the scoring criteria are the same. And it just depends how well it's been explained and presented. We can only go by what's in writing at the table.
Yeah, we have a phrase that we can only look at what is presented in the narrative in your application. We can't look, if you give us a link and you say, click on this link to learn more about, we're not allowed to do that. We're not allowed to take a look at your semi-annual and annual reports. We can only look at what is in the application. And on the scoring panel, we will talk about, this applicant left points on the table because that they're doing certain type of work, but they didn't explain it.
Yeah.
And we can't give you credit for it if you don't have it in the application.
Yes. And that is torture for us when we know that you're doing something really cool and really unique, and it's not in the application.
So we've got about
Okay.
11 minutes left in.
Okay, in the interest of time, we're going to go quickly to key personnel, and we've kind of touched on some of it. Next slide, please. Oh, what happened to key personnel?
You go back a slide.
Back a slide, please. There we go. Sorry, I asked you to move and it was fine. Key thing here, please don't put resumes in the text. Do a short synopsis of the skill sets of the people that are assigned to the tasks in your work plan. Make sure if you include someone in your work plan that you also include them in the key qualifications section. If you're looking to hire consultants or using consultants, identify whether they've already committed to the project or not. And then identify whether they're full or part-time. One thing I will say, and this is a strange illustration, but I hope it will be helpful. If I'm a person looking to open a McDonald's franchise and I want somebody to help me, and I've got two people sitting in front of me, one that has 10 years of experience and the other one that has 10 years of experience. How am I going to decide who I'm going to hire or who I'm going to ask assistance from? The person who's got 10 years as a cashier experience, or the person who worked their way up from mopping the floors through all the jobs at McDonald's to the point where they're now a manager or potentially an owner. The one that gives information is the one that has the 10 years of experience in a wide variety of spots. So keep that in mind when you're writing the information about your key personnel that are providing the assistance. Give examples of things that they've done in the past. Give examples of experience, work that they've completed, and tie that to the tasks that you're asking them to do in the work plan. Okay, I'm going to stop with that.
Good.
Okay, next slide. I believe this is Megan.
Yeah, this is me. So we are going to evaluate each application for future and local support. So what you are going to do is talk about your previous and expected local support, your plans for coordination with other developmental organizations, and possibly state and local governments. You are going to score higher if you demonstrate strong support. You can submit a maximum of 10 letters of support or intent to coordinate with the applicant. And you want to make sure that these letters are from a variety of partners and clients, and include descriptions of the relationship and the support provided. You want to make sure that the letters are recent and signed and really reflect the individual support provided. One of the things that you want to really be sure of is that you don't include letters from some of your service providers, some of the people that you're paying, with the RCDG grant, or any of the people who are providing a match. So that would not be good. So next slide. Okay, so you need to talk about future support. You want to have a vision for what your center is going to do in the future. You want to look at new and existing funding sources that can support the goals of the center. And you want to look at funding sources that reduce your reliance on government grants. You want to look at the use of in-house personnel for providing services, versus contracting out. So you want to talk about how you're going to build in-house technical assistance. And it's, definitely discuss that training and professional development. And you can use the RCDG grants for professional development for your staff. So next slide.
I think that's me, Megan.
It is.
So administrator points, I know we're short on time, and choose, and that is the administrator of Rural Business Cooperative Service, which at this point is Dr. Karama Neal. And you can get 5 points if you have never received an RCDG award, and you can get another 5 points if your application discusses how you're going to advance one or more key priorities addressed in the supplemental section. And those 3 priorities are in that blue box, which are climate change and environmental resilience, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or economic recovery. You can list one thing, you can list all 3 things or 2 things, but how are you going to advance any of those priorities? And we also gave you the links to get to those sites. Next slide, please. I'm going to kind of rush through these. Here we've got some resources. Gave you the first link is to the Rural Cooperative Development Grant information on our website. Also the home link to grants.gov, where you're going to need to submit your application. The link to SAM, which is our system for award management, to be registered. There's also underneath that is a video on grants.gov and sam.gov. So if you need assistance, it may be helpful for you. I've been told it's it's very good for first timers and helps them get through that process. And then also the past workshops there from USDA RD, those could be for different programs, but sometimes people have said that things that they had gone over in those workshops help them with another program's grant application. We also wanted to include the 2 CFR that we referenced earlier, so you would know where to find that information. And next slide. If you this link here to visit USDA RD eligibility map is how you would determine if it is in our eyes a rural area, and there's instructions on how to do that. I'll go to the next slide. And these are just tips on when we had how to apply tips. This is the sam.gov. There's just make sure that your sam.gov registration now or your earlier is that it must match this same entity in your SF424 as in sam.gov. It has to be the same entity and employee identification number. So your tax number. If this is your first time registering in SAM, I highly recommend you print out or have that entity registration checklist, because those are all the documents you may need to answer all the questions that they're going to be asking you. There's also an 800 number for SAM if you have issues. And then important registrations is you register for financial assistance awards only. That is the most common for RD customers. You can register for all awards. It's acceptable. It's just not the most common, but definitely what is not acceptable is just getting that unique entity ID only, the UEI. It is not a SAM registration. So next slide. Common mistakes are, as Deb mentioned before, the participant support costs that equal 10% of the total grant funds requested. It's not project funds, it's grant funds. Operating expenses of the applicant that are not related to the project. Could be goods or services from a person who has a conflict of interest with the grantee. And I think, Deb, you were supposed to go over this slide. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
I'm just like trying to go, or duplicative work plan tasks, which we've gone over. The next slide, I believe, is conflicts of interest. And I'm not going to read all that, or
Deb could probably briefly describe it.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, basically the conflict of interest is it is either real or perceived that somebody is not able to make an impartial decision because they're either being paid from the grant or they're somehow connected to the operation of the center. So for example, if I operated a cooperative development center and I wanted to hire my brother as a consultant to work on the project, that would be a conflict of interest, because how likely is he going to come in and tell me that a project shouldn't move forward when he's going to get paid to give me an answer? So it's awkward. So family members, board members, you cannot pay board members to provide services. That's a conflict of interest. That's basically any time where you would kind of take a second and pause and go, how would that look if it showed up on the front page of the newspaper? That's when you might want to ask yourself, is that a conflict of interest? So that's kind of a down and dirty way to look at conflict of interest. Is if it showed up on the front page of the news, would you be embarrassed for it to be there? Or would you feel uncomfortable if the media got a hold of that? That's kind of the easiest, litmus test.
There's a question from Kevin Edberg. in the qualification section, we need to demonstrate that contractors are committed to the project, but we cannot use letters from the contractors to evidence their commitment in the local regional support. Is it sufficient to simply assert their commitment versus evidencing their commitment via a letter? Or how do we otherwise evidence their commitment?
Okay. Yeah, the commitment we're talking about is two different things. The commitment to the work plan is whether or not they're available. Are they available? And that could be as simple as, yes, we've contacted them, we've received confirmation that they're available and interested in working on this project. The commitment for the commitment section, so letters, really needs to be from the beneficiaries of the project, not from the people that are potentially going to be paid. That's actually a perfect example of a conflict of interest.
So yeah, local and future support, that's the criteria. You want to have letters from partners and clients.
Yeah, sorry.
You do not want somebody who's going to be paid from the grant. As Debbie said, conflict of interest. We are going to toss those letters, we are not going to look at them.
It won't count.
And sorry, another Thomas, just trying to get this through before we're over time. I'm sorry, but Thomas said definitely make sure your SAM.gov and grants.gov and logins.gov accounts are current and valid now. In regards to SAM.gov, if you do have issues and for something is not going right, just at least put in your application something that you are trying to get it corrected. Sometimes waivers are given, I know in years past, because there were issues with SAM.gov and the time frame they were being responsive was not good. So I wouldn't give up if for some reason your registration isn't working. Hopefully maybe we could get that rectified before awards are announced.
Right. And if you run into something like that, I would suggest contacting Lisa Sharp, whose email is in Alpha, because she's the program person that's going to make the decision of how to handle that.
And Tracy, I wanted to give you some feedback about the template. We are going to bring that to the attention of Lisa Sharp as well, because we don't want anybody to be penalized as a result of the template being wrong.
Right.
And there's another question. Sandra says, can a consultant hired to provide a feasibility study will now work with the group as a co-op development specialist?
Can you provide more
Repeat it.
information? I'm not sure I understand the question, Sandra. Oh, okay.
So you've hired that
Is
person?
that
Have you hired that person? I think that would be fine.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, if they're now on your staff, I don't see that as a conflict of interest. If they were if they were somehow related to that group, that would be awkward. That would be I'd probably give me pause. You've hired them before to work with this group. So then now that they're on staff, I don't see that there's a reason that they couldn't.
Yeah, I think going from, being a contractor to being on staff, there's no problem with conflict of interest hiring that person.
Right.
I think that was our last slide, but we can advance it one just to be sure.
I just want to clarify for purposes of the, video that what Tracy was talking about was the template it does not include, the executive summary and what was the other?
Eligibility discussion.
Right, in the 40 pages. And so that's a problem, and we'll bring that up with Lisa Sharp.
My guess is that that will be liberally interpreted this year,
Yeah,
because we're so late in the game. Okay.
Well, I think this has been a full hour and a half of thoughtful questions, a good discussion. If you have any more questions, please feel free to reach out to any one of us or to Lisa Sharp. And thank you, NCBA, for hosting this. Thank you to Cooperation Works for making the request to have this event. We wish you all the best as you work on your RCDG applications. We're looking forward to learning about the good work that you're doing, that you have planned for the coming year. So best wishes, and we'll be in touch. Feel free to reach out to us. Thanks.
Yes. Okay.